A little girl saved the millionaire's son, and what he did next would change both their lives forever. Nicholas Hale had never considered that one moment of distraction could change everything. He had spent his entire life believing that order and control were what kept the world in place, and he had built his success on never letting himself lose focus. That afternoon, he was pacing slowly along the wide paved path of the park near his company's offices, his phone pressed to his ear as he tried to finish a call that should have ended an hour ago. The late sun was sliding toward the horizon, turning the tops of the trees gold, and a faint breeze stirred the leaves and carried the smell of fresh grass and warm pavement. He could see his 4-year-old son, Alex, a few yards ahead, weaving between benches and flower beds with the bright, clumsy energy of a child who hadn't learned to be afraid of anything yet. Every so often, Alex glanced over his shoulder to be sure his father was still watching. Each time, Nicholas lifted his free hand in a reassuring little wave, not breaking his conversation but trying to make sure the boy knew he wasn't alone. Alex had been talking all day about the pigeons he'd seen on their last walk, about how he was going to chase them and maybe catch one just to see if its feathers were as soft as he imagined. Nicholas had smiled and nodded, promising they'd come back when he had time, never thinking it would happen on a day like this, when he was carrying the stress of 6 meetings and an unresolved contract that felt too important to ignore. He was just turning away to check the message that had buzzed in his other pocket when he heard the sudden high pitch of tires gripping asphalt. His heart stopped in the space of a single breath, and he looked up to see that Alex had strayed from the safe curve of the path and was only a few steps from the edge of the road. For an instant Nicholas couldn't move. He felt the world narrow to the small shape of his son, the too-close car, the sound of his own heartbeat roaring in his ears. But before he could take a single step forward, something blurred past the edge of his vision. A small figure in a pink t-shirt and a denim skirt came running so fast she almost stumbled. He watched, frozen, as the girl reached Alex, grabbed him by the shoulders with both hands, and gave a sharp push that sent him sprawling backward onto the grass. Her own knees hit the gravel hard enough that he could hear the sound even from where he stood, and she landed on her palms to keep from falling on her face. The car braked with a shriek of rubber and stopped just beyond where Alex had been standing. For a second, no one moved. Nicholas felt as if he were standing behind glass, unable to do anything but watch. He could see Alex sitting up on the grass, dazed but unhurt, and the girl on her hands and knees with her blonde hair spilling over her face as she tried to catch her breath. His phone slid from his hand onto the path without him noticing. He started forward, and it felt like waking up from a bad dream that had turned out to be real. He dropped to his knees next to Alex, his hands shaking as he checked for any sign of injury. The boy looked up at him with wide blue eyes so like his own, and Nicholas realized he was holding his breath until Alex spoke in a small, trembling voice that cracked halfway through. "Daddy, she saved me." Nicholas swallowed against the tightness in his throat, and his gaze shifted to the girl who had moved back a little, sitting on her heels with her scraped hands folded in her lap. She looked even smaller now that she wasn't moving. Her arms were thin, and her knees were scraped raw where the gravel had torn the skin. She was breathing fast, and her chin trembled as if she were trying not to cry. In that instant, Nicholas felt something split inside his chest, something he hadn't even known was still capable of breaking. He reached out a hand toward her without thinking, wanting to thank her, to steady her, to understand why a child he'd never seen before had risked herself without a moment's hesitation. The girl didn't move away when Nicholas reached his hand toward her, but she didn't take it either. She looked up at him with wide blue eyes, and he could see her lower lip tremble as she tried to keep her composure. Her palms were scraped open in ragged patches of red and gray grit, and there were tiny specks of gravel stuck to the tears on her knees, but she didn't make a sound of complaint or reach to brush them clean. For a long moment, Nicholas simply stared at her, unable to form a single word. He was aware of the hush that had settled over the path, the curious glances of passers-by who slowed when they saw a man in a suit crouched beside 2 children, the hush that only follows something narrowly avoided. He realized his heart was still pounding so hard that he felt it in the back of his throat. He swallowed, searching for words he hadn't needed in years, the kind that were meant for comfort rather than commands. When he finally spoke, his voice came out softer than he expected. "Are you all right?" he asked, careful not to startle her. "You're hurt." The girl blinked quickly, as if she were startled by the idea that someone was worried about her, and then she looked down at her hands and pressed them together as though she were trying to hide the raw skin. She didn't answer. Nicholas felt a ripple of frustration that he quickly recognized was only fear in another shape. He didn't want to frighten her further. He shifted his attention to Alex, who had crawled closer to the girl and was staring at her with enormous eyes. Alex was never shy, but now he seemed unable to find the words either. He reached out a tentative hand, not quite touching her. "You saved me," he said finally, so quietly it almost disappeared into the hush around them. The girl lifted her head again, and a single tear slid down her cheek, leaving a bright path through the dust on her skin. Nicholas drew in a slow breath, willing himself to stay calm so he could think clearly. He knew he needed to get both children out of the middle of the path. He stood carefully and bent to scoop Alex into his arms. The boy clung to his shoulder, his small hands tightening in the fabric of Nicholas's suit jacket, and Nicholas felt an ache deep in his chest that was equal parts relief and shame that he had looked away for even a moment. He looked back at the girl, still sitting there as if she didn't know what she was supposed to do next. He couldn't leave her there. He crouched again, ignoring the stiffness in his knees, and tried to make his voice sound as reassuring as possible. "What's your name?" he asked. "Can you tell me?" She hesitated so long he thought she wouldn't answer, and then she whispered, "Hannah." He repeated it softly, tasting the shape of it on his tongue, a name too small for the courage she had shown. "Hannah," he said again, "I want to help you. Can you stand up?" For the first time, she looked directly at him, and in that look was something so raw it made his throat tighten. She didn't look afraid of him. She looked as if no one had offered to help her in a long time, maybe ever. She nodded once, a tiny, reluctant movement, and pressed her palms carefully to the gravel to push herself upright. When she stood, she wobbled, and he automatically reached out to steady her with his free hand. Her arm was so thin under his palm it startled him, and he realized how slight she was, how easily she could have been hurt or worse in the moment she'd chosen to act. He didn't let go until he was sure she could keep her balance. He looked down at Alex, who had turned his head to peer at her again, and saw the boy's face scrunch up with something like wonder. "Daddy, can she come home with us?" he asked, his voice small but certain. Nicholas's heart clenched so hard he nearly lost his breath. He looked at Hannah, at the dirt smudges on her clothes, the small brave tilt of her chin, and thought he had never seen anything so quietly extraordinary. "Let's take it one step at a time," he said softly, not sure who he was reassuring more, his son or himself. He turned back to Hannah and asked, "Where is your family?" She looked at her scraped hands again, and when she spoke, her voice was so soft he had to bend closer to hear it. "I don't have one anymore." Her words were simple, but they landed in him with a weight that nothing in his long career of difficult negotiations and heavy decisions had ever equaled. He felt something inside him shift, something he couldn't name yet but knew he wouldn't be able to set aside. He straightened, feeling the breeze ruffle his hair and Alex's as he held the boy tighter. "Then we'll figure this out together," he said quietly. And though he still didn't know exactly what he was promising, he knew it was the truth. Nicholas felt as if the world had narrowed to just this small circle of quiet where the three of them stood. Everything beyond it, the cars crawling by, the curious glances of people on the sidewalk, the soft rustling of leaves, seemed to recede into a dull, unimportant blur. He watched Hannah shift her weight on her scraped feet, her eyes darting between him and Alex with an anxious uncertainty that made her look even younger than she was. He realized with a sudden ache that no child should have eyes that guarded, that used to being ignored. He glanced down at his son, who was still tucked against his chest, and saw that Alex was watching Hannah with an open, unblinking curiosity that held no fear or suspicion. Only a kind of instinctive recognition that she mattered because she had stepped into danger without a thought for herself. That was something Nicholas couldn't ever repay, no matter how many polite words he could summon. He turned a little so he could look Hannah in the face without towering over her, and he asked again in the gentlest voice he could find, "Is there someone I can call for you? Any relative or a neighbor?" She only shook her head, once, so slightly that it might have been a flinch. Nicholas felt his stomach twist, because it was the kind of answer that carried an entire story she didn't have the words to tell. He swallowed and studied the raw scrapes on her hands and knees, the way her shoulders hunched forward as if she was waiting for scolding or dismissal. It occurred to him that she probably didn't expect anyone to thank her, let alone offer her help. And in that instant, he felt something inside him that had nothing to do with duty or gratitude. It was a kind of fierce protectiveness he hadn't felt since the day Alex was born. A voice in the back of his mind whispered that this was not his responsibility, that he should hand her over to the authorities, but he ignored it as he had ignored 1,000 lesser instincts in his life when something truly important was at stake. Alex shifted in his arms and whispered, "Daddy, she's bleeding." Nicholas followed his son's gaze to the dirt-caked wounds on Hannah's palms. He crouched again so their faces were nearly level, careful to keep his voice steady, and said, "Hannah, I'd like to take you somewhere safe so we can clean up your hands and make sure you're okay. Is that all right with you?" She looked at him as if she didn't quite believe he was speaking to her and then nodded in a hesitant, jerky way. He stood, adjusting Alex so he could free one hand, and held it out to her without thinking. She stared at it, her small brows pulling together in confusion. After a long moment, she reached out and let her scraped fingers rest lightly in his palm. The simple trust of that touch made something crack wide open in his chest. He closed his fingers gently around hers, feeling how cold and fragile her hand was, and squeezed just enough to say without words that she wasn't alone anymore. They started walking slowly back toward where his car was parked. Each step felt unreal, as if he had crossed into a different life in the space of a few minutes. He tried to think what he would tell the driver or what explanation he could give if someone asked why he was bringing a child he'd never met into his home. But the longer they walked, the less he cared how it would look. Alex tucked his head against Nicholas's shoulder, watching Hannah over the curve of his father's arm with wide, solemn eyes. Every few steps, Hannah glanced up at Nicholas and then back at the pavement, as if she was still testing whether she'd imagined the offer of safety. When they reached the car, Nicholas nodded to the driver, whose eyebrows shot up at the sight of Hannah's dirt-smudged face and raw knees. But he didn't ask questions. Nicholas had chosen his staff carefully over the years, and they knew when to keep silent. He helped Hannah climb into the back seat first, guiding her with a gentle hand on her shoulder. She sat stiffly on the edge of the leather seat as if she expected to be told to get out again at any moment. Nicholas set Alex down next to her, and the boy immediately reached for her scraped hand with all the easy, instinctive kindness of a child who didn't see any difference between them. Hannah looked startled, but she didn't pull away. For the first time, Nicholas saw her mouth soften into something like the beginning of a smile. It was small and uncertain, but it was there. As the car pulled away from the curb, he settled in across from them and studied the two children sitting side by side. He had no plan for what would happen when they reached his house, no neat solution to the tangle of questions waiting for him, but he felt a calmness he hadn't known in years. He realized that sometimes you didn't need a plan to do the right thing. Sometimes you only needed to start by taking one frightened hand in yours and promising you wouldn't let go. The car ride was almost completely silent, except for the occasional soft rustle of Hannah's skirt when she shifted her legs or the faint sound of Alex drawing in a shaky breath after everything that had just happened. Nicholas sat opposite them, his hands resting on his knees, watching the two small figures on the leather seat with a sense of unreality that kept creeping in like a draft under a door. In all his years of building companies, managing crises, and making decisions that shaped the lives of thousands of employees, he had never once felt so entirely unprepared. He didn't know how to comfort a child who had lost everything or how to make sense of what it would mean to bring her into his life, even temporarily. But when he looked at Hannah's scraped hands folded carefully in her lap and the way she kept sneaking glances at Alex as though she couldn't quite believe she was allowed to sit beside him, he knew with absolute certainty that taking her with them had been the only choice that made sense. As they drove through the quiet streets, Nicholas studied her small face in the glow of the passing streetlights. Her cheeks were streaked with dirt and tears, and her hair had fallen loose from whatever clip or ribbon had once held it back. Even so, there was something composed about the way she sat, as if she had learned early not to expect anyone to look after her. That realization pressed against his heart in a way he couldn't ignore. He thought about how many nights he had lain awake in his enormous house, haunted by the fear that he wasn't doing enough for Alex, that no amount of money or comfort could replace the mother he had lost before he was old enough to remember her. And now here was this little girl, who had given all the care she had in one instinctive moment to save his son, even when no one had ever taught her that anyone would do the same for her. At a red light, he leaned forward slightly and spoke, careful to keep his tone calm so she wouldn't flinch. "Hannah," he said, and when she looked up, her blue eyes were enormous in the dimness of the car, "I know you don't know me, and this is probably very confusing. But I want you to know you did something very brave today. You protected Alex when I couldn't." He hesitated, searching for the right words, the kind that were simple enough for a child to understand but true enough not to sound hollow. "You're safe now, all right? No one is going to ask you to leave." She didn't say anything, but her lips parted as though she might try, and for an instant, he saw something flicker across her expression, something fragile and almost too painful to look at. It was hope. She glanced down again, studying her hands as if they belonged to someone else, and Nicholas felt his throat tighten. He wondered how long it had been since anyone had told her she was safe. When the car finally pulled through the iron gates at the end of the long drive, Hannah straightened a little, her eyes wide as she took in the massive house. Even in the dark, with only a few lights glowing in the windows, the place looked almost like something out of a storybook. Nicholas had always thought of it as too big and too quiet, a reminder of everything he had lost, but tonight it felt different. It felt, for the first time, like there might be enough space inside it for something other than loneliness. He helped Alex climb out first and then turned to Hannah, offering his hand again. She looked at it for so long he thought she wouldn't take it, but then she lifted her chin and slipped her small, scraped fingers into his. The simple trust of that touch undid him more than any tears could have. They stepped into the foyer together, the polished floors reflecting the warm light from the chandeliers overhead. Hannah hesitated on the threshold, her eyes darting from the high ceilings to the staircase and back to Nicholas, as if she were trying to decide if she was really allowed to stand there. One of the house staff came forward, her face creased in concern, but Nicholas lifted a hand to stop the questions before they began. "This is Hannah," he said, his voice steady even though he felt anything but steady inside. "She'll be staying with us for a while." He didn't know how long a while would be, but saying it out loud made it feel real, and he realized he wanted it to be real. He wanted her to feel that here, at least, she didn't have to wonder where she belonged. He led her into the kitchen, where he knew the light would be softer, and gestured to a chair. Hannah sat carefully on the very edge, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap again. She looked so small and tired that he felt an ache in his chest he didn't know how to soothe. He moved to the sink, filling a basin with warm water and finding the first aid kit he kept in a drawer he never used. As he carried everything back to the table, he felt Alex slip his hand into his again. The boy looked up at him, his blue eyes solemn. "Daddy, are we going to help her?" he asked, as if he already knew the answer. Nicholas looked at him and then at Hannah, who was watching them both with that same wary, silent hope. He drew in a breath that felt steadier than he expected and said, "Yes, we are." And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt certain that whatever came next, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Nicholas set the basin of warm water and the first aid kit on the kitchen table and pulled a chair around so he could sit facing Hannah. The overhead light glowed softly across her hair, catching every little curl and making her look more like the child she should have been and less like the frightened stranger who had saved his son. She kept her gaze lowered, her scraped hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. He could see the tiny tremor in her shoulders and realized she was bracing herself for something she didn't have words for, something she clearly expected to hurt or shame her. A wave of protective sorrow rose so sharply in his chest that he had to take a moment before he trusted himself to speak without his voice breaking. He drew in a breath and reached carefully for her hands. When his fingers brushed her small, dirt-smeared knuckles, she flinched, and he felt her whole body stiffen. But she didn't pull away, and after a moment, she lifted her eyes just enough to meet his. That one flicker of trust settled something deep in his chest, and he felt the terrible sense of helplessness begin to ease, replaced by a quiet conviction that whatever happened next, he would not let her face it alone. He spoke in the low, steady voice he used when Alex woke crying from nightmares. "I'm going to clean these cuts, all right? It might sting a little, but I'll be as gentle as I can." She didn't answer, but her fingers uncurled fractionally, and that was enough for him. He dipped a clean cloth in the warm water and began wiping away the grit and dried blood. As soon as the cloth touched her skin, she winced and drew in a shaky breath, but she didn't make a sound. He worked slowly, pausing every few seconds to let her adjust. The dirt gave way to pale, tender skin, and he saw that the scrapes were deeper than he'd first thought, the kind of injury that must have hurt terribly even before the shock wore off. He realized with an ache that she hadn't spared a thought for herself when she'd seen Alex in danger. She had simply acted. He thought of all the meetings he'd sat in, surrounded by people who claimed courage was making the hard decisions, and it struck him how little any of that had to do with the bravery it took for a child to throw herself into harm's way for someone she didn't even know. At the edge of his vision, he saw Alex climbing carefully into the chair next to Hannah. The boy sat on his knees so he could see over the table, his small hands planted flat on the surface. He didn't speak, but he watched every motion Nicholas made, his wide blue eyes solemn. When Nicholas glanced up, Alex nodded once, as if to say he approved of his father's care. The sight filled him with a tenderness that almost undid him completely. For so long, he had worried he wasn't enough for his son, that his quiet, serious way of loving would never fill the space his wife had left behind. But watching Alex now, he realized that children learned compassion by seeing it modeled, and maybe he had done more right than he'd ever allowed himself to believe. When the last of the grit was gone, he gently dried Hannah's hands with a soft towel and reached for the antiseptic. She drew back fractionally at the sight of the bottle, her eyes going wide, and he lifted his palm in a calming gesture. "I promise it won't last long," he said quietly. "Would you like to hold my hand while I do it?" For a heartbeat, she didn't move, and then she nodded, just once. He offered his free hand, and she wrapped her small fingers around two of his. Her grip was surprisingly strong, but he didn't mind. If it helped her feel safe, he would have let her hold on as tightly as she needed. He dabbed the antiseptic carefully onto each scrape, pausing whenever she sucked in a breath or squeezed his hand tighter. When he was done, he unwrapped a bandage and pressed it over the largest cut. Her skin was warm beneath his fingers, and he felt a fierce determination that he would never let her be hurt like this again if he could help it. When he finished, he set the supplies aside and looked at her properly for the first time since they'd sat down. Her face was pale, but her breathing had slowed, and her shoulders weren't quite so tense. She didn't let go of his hand right away, and he didn't try to pull free. Instead, he covered her smaller fingers with his other palm, making a quiet promise he hoped she would feel even if she couldn't yet believe it. Alex leaned forward a little, his hair falling into his eyes, and said in his small, clear voice, "Does it still hurt?" Hannah blinked as if she hadn't expected anyone to ask, and then she whispered, "Not as much." Her voice was so tentative, but it held a note of relief that made Nicholas's throat tighten. He looked from her to Alex, feeling something settle into place in his chest, something that felt a lot like purpose. In that moment, he knew with unshakable certainty that she was no longer just the girl who had saved his son. She was someone he was meant to protect, to care for, to welcome into the part of his life he had thought would always stay empty. He realized, as the silence wrapped around them, that he would do whatever it took to make her feel she belonged. When the kitchen had grown quiet again and Hannah's breathing had steadied to something more like normal, Nicholas gently loosened his hand from hers and stood to pour a glass of water. He felt her eyes follow every movement he made, wary and searching, as if she were trying to memorize what kind of man he was before she let herself believe he was safe. He understood that kind of watchfulness because he had lived his own version of it after his wife had died. He had learned then that loss rewrote all the rules of trust and that nothing came back easily once it was broken. As he set the glass in front of her, he thought that maybe the smallest gestures were the ones that mattered most now: clean water in a glass, a quiet place to sit, the simple respect of speaking to her as if she had every right to be there. He sat again across from her and folded his hands on the table because he didn't know what else to do with them. His voice felt almost too careful in his throat when he spoke, but he forced himself to ask, "Hannah, where have you been staying?" For a moment she didn't answer, and he wondered if she would refuse to speak at all. But then she lifted her chin, her mouth pressing into a line that was somehow both proud and afraid. "Different places," she said quietly. Sometimes people let me sleep on their porch." She didn't say it with any trace of complaint, only a tired resignation that made something deep inside him go cold. No child should have to tell a stranger she had been living on porches. He glanced down at Alex, who was listening with wide, solemn eyes, and realized his son was learning in real time just how big the world's unfairness could be. Nicholas took a slow breath and nodded, trying not to let the rawness in his throat show. "Thank you for telling me," he said softly. "I'm glad you're here now. You don't have to worry tonight." He meant every word, but he knew he couldn't leave it at that. He would have to make calls, speak to the authorities, find out what legal options existed. He had never fostered a child before, never imagined that his life would intersect with someone like Hannah in any way. Yet the thought of letting her disappear into the machinery of shelters and caseworkers made him feel almost sick with dread. He looked across the table and thought that if there was any decency left in him at all, he would find a way to keep her safe, no matter how complicated it became. Alex climbed off his chair and stepped closer to Hannah without hesitation. He reached out and touched the edge of the bandage on her hand as if to check that she was really all right. When she didn't flinch away, he smiled a little and said, "I'm glad you were there." Hannah blinked, her mouth parting in surprise, and for the first time since he had met her, Nicholas saw a real, unguarded expression cross her face. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was something softer, something that looked almost like relief. She didn't answer, but she curled her fingers around the edge of her seat, her shoulders sinking just a little as if she was finally starting to believe she didn't have to be ready to run. Nicholas rose and moved to the cabinet, taking out a small plate. He didn't want to overwhelm her, but he knew she needed food as much as she needed reassurance. He placed a few slices of buttered toast and an apple on the plate and set it in front of her. "Eat as much as you want," he told her gently. "There's more if you're hungry." She looked down at the food, her lashes casting dark shadows on her cheeks, and for a moment she didn't move. Then she picked up the toast with both hands, careful not to pull at the fresh bandage, and took the smallest bite he'd ever seen. He watched her chew and swallow, and it struck him that she was trying not to eat too quickly, that she was used to rationing whatever she was given. He felt that same cold fury and sorrow gather in his chest, and he knew without a doubt that she deserved better than a life spent waiting for the next kindness to be taken away. While she ate, Nicholas moved to the sideboard to make a few calls, speaking in a low voice so she wouldn't feel like he was discussing her as if she weren't there. He contacted his lawyer, explaining the situation in careful, precise terms. The man was silent for a moment and then said that he would start making inquiries immediately. Nicholas ended the call feeling both relieved and more aware than ever that this was only the beginning of something bigger than he could yet understand. When he turned back, he saw that Hannah had finished the toast and was holding the apple in her lap as if she wasn't sure if she was allowed to eat it too. He crossed the kitchen and crouched so they were eye to eye again. "It's all for you," he said quietly. "You don't have to save any for later." For a moment, she didn't answer. But then she nodded, a tiny, almost shy movement, and took a slow bite. He watched her chew and felt something loosen in his chest. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew this much: tonight, she would sleep under a safe roof, and tomorrow, he would find a way to keep her there as long as she wanted. It was a promise he made to himself as he stood again, feeling Alex press close to his side in silent agreement. In that kitchen, with the warm lamplight and the quiet sound of a child eating her first real meal in too long, he felt something take root in his heart that he hadn't dared believe possible. It felt a lot like hope. Nicholas stayed close to the table while Hannah ate, pretending to busy himself with small tasks so she wouldn't feel that all eyes were on her. He wiped the countertop that was already clean, refilled Alex's cup with water he didn't really need, and moved a stack of papers from one end of the counter to the other. It wasn't that he needed to keep his hands busy, he needed to give her space to feel like she was allowed to be here, that this kitchen wasn't just a temporary stop before someone sent her away again. Every so often, he glanced over and saw her watching him, her expression caught between suspicion and something that looked very much like longing. He realized she was trying to understand whether this kindness was real or whether it would vanish if she made a wrong move. That thought made his throat ache in a way he didn't have words for. When she finally set the apple core carefully on the plate, she folded her hands in her lap and looked down, as if bracing herself for whatever would happen next. He dried his hands on a towel and moved to sit across from her, lowering himself into the chair slowly so he wouldn't startle her. Alex had settled in the chair to her left, his chin propped in his palms as he watched her with the patient attention only small children seemed to have. Nicholas studied the way Hannah's shoulders were still tense, the way her narrow back seemed almost braced for a blow she had learned to expect, and he understood that he would have to be deliberate with every word he spoke. He drew in a quiet breath, made sure his voice was calm, and said, "Hannah, I know today has been very frightening. You were so brave, and you did something that most grown-ups wouldn't have done. You helped Alex, and you helped me. I can't ever thank you enough for that." She didn't look up, but her hands clenched in her lap, and he thought maybe no one had ever told her that her courage mattered. He waited, letting the silence stretch just long enough that she might feel she was allowed to speak if she wanted to. When she didn't, he continued, "I've spoken to some people I trust to help me figure out how to keep you safe. I don't know exactly what the next few days will look like, but you won't have to sleep outside anymore." At that, her gaze flicked up to meet his, and her eyes were so bright and wary that he had to press his hands together to keep from reaching for her again. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. "But, where will I go?" she asked, and the words were so soft that he could tell she already expected the answer to be somewhere she didn't want to be. He felt something settle heavily in his chest, a quiet, immovable certainty. "You'll stay here for now," he said simply. "If you want to. No one will make you go anywhere you don't want to go." Even as he said it, he knew it was only part of the truth, that there were rules and systems waiting to sweep her up and categorize her, to decide what box she belonged in. But he also knew that he had resources and influence that most people didn't, and he had never been afraid to use them. If she needed him to, he would become whatever advocate she required. He would call in favors and bend rules and fill out every form until he could look her in the eyes and tell her she was staying. It surprised him how natural that decision felt, how right it was in a way nothing else had been since he lost his wife. Alex turned toward Hannah then, his small voice breaking the quiet. "I think you could sleep in the room across from mine," he offered earnestly. "It has the stars on the ceiling." He was talking about the guest room that Nicholas had never gotten around to redecorating after his wife died. It still had the glow-in-the-dark stickers she had put there, thinking that someday it would be for a little girl. Nicholas felt his breath catch because he had avoided even looking in that room for years, but somehow the thought of Hannah lying under those soft green stars didn't feel painful. It felt almost like coming full circle. Hannah's mouth moved, and for a moment, she didn't speak. When she finally whispered, "I've never had my own room," the simple honesty of it sliced through every last defense Nicholas had left. He reached across the table, this time not caring if she flinched, and laid his hand very lightly over hers. Her fingers tensed, then slowly relaxed, as if she was making the same decision he was, to trust, even if it hurt. "Well," he said softly, steadying his voice because it felt thick in his throat, "then it's about time you did." They stayed there like that, hands touching on the smooth wooden table, the warm kitchen light holding them in a fragile circle of quiet. Nicholas knew there were things he couldn't promise. He couldn't say the road ahead would be easy or that she wouldn't have moments when all this felt too much. But he could promise she would not face it alone. As he looked at her small face, still pale and bruised with exhaustion but beginning to soften around the edges, he felt something he hadn't in so long he barely recognized it. It was hope, yes, but more than that, it was the certainty that this unexpected, tender connection was exactly what all of them needed. And in that moment, as Alex reached over to rest his hand beside theirs, Nicholas finally understood that maybe this was the way a family could begin, not through plans or expectations, but through the simple, quiet choice to stay. The house had always felt too big at night, a cavernous place where Nicholas could hear his own footsteps echoing down the hallways long after Alex was asleep. He used to think that silence was simply the price of survival after losing his wife, that emptiness was the only safe alternative to heartbreak. But as he carried a folded blanket and a fresh set of sheets into the guest room with the glow-in-the-dark stars, he realized that maybe it had never really been safety he was clinging to. Maybe it was fear. He paused on the threshold and looked around the small, neatly kept room. The soft blue curtains moved gently in the draft from the vent, and the bed looked too crisp and untouched, as if it were waiting all these years for someone to belong there. He thought about how Hannah had said she had never had her own room, and something in his chest loosened and then settled with a quiet, unexpected peace. When he turned, he saw her standing just inside the doorway, her hands tucked close to her stomach as though she didn't trust herself not to reach for something she shouldn't touch. Her eyes were wide, sweeping over the painted stars on the ceiling and the pale furniture as if she was trying to memorize every detail before it could be taken away. She didn't step farther into the room, only hovered at the threshold, as if afraid the whole offer might dissolve if she believed in it too quickly. Nicholas realized he was holding his breath, waiting to see whether she would find the courage to cross that invisible line. He bent to set the blanket on the end of the bed and turned so she could see his face. "This is yours for as long as you want it," he said, keeping his voice low so she would hear the steadiness he didn't entirely feel. "No one is going to take it away." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she lifted one hand and traced the edge of the doorframe with her fingertips, her expression caught between wonder and fear. He could see how tired she was, how her small shoulders looked like they were holding up a weight no child should ever have to carry. But slowly, so slowly it felt almost like watching a time-lapse of a flower opening, she stepped into the room. She walked to the bed and brushed her fingers over the neatly folded blanket as if testing whether it was real. When she turned to face him, there was something shining in her eyes that wasn't only exhaustion. It was the beginning of trust, a fragile flicker of belief that maybe she didn't have to keep running. Nicholas knew she would need more than a warm bed and kind words to feel safe here. She would need time and consistency and patience he wasn't sure he possessed, but as he looked at her, he understood that he was willing to find out. He crossed to the little dresser by the window and opened the top drawer so she could see it was empty, waiting for her things. "If you want to put your clothes here, you can," he said, though he knew she had arrived with nothing but the dust on her shoes. She looked at the drawer and then back at him, her brow creasing as if she was trying to decide whether she was allowed to ask the question she was carrying. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet he almost missed it. "Will I be here tomorrow?" For a moment, he couldn't answer. He thought of all the bureaucratic steps that waited, all the forms and interviews and signatures that would have to happen before any of this could be permanent. But he also knew that for tonight, for this small moment in the hush of the hallway, she needed something simpler than technicalities. She needed someone to choose her without hesitation. So he looked her straight in the eyes and said, "Yes. You'll be here tomorrow. And the day after that. For as long as you want." Her mouth wobbled then, the beginning of a sob she was trying to swallow. Before she could turn away, Nicholas knelt so they were eye level. He reached out, carefully so she would have time to refuse if she needed to, and rested his hand lightly on her shoulder. For a long moment, she stood frozen. Then she took a single step forward and buried her face against his chest, her small hands curling in the fabric of his shirt. He felt her shoulders begin to shake, felt the first warm drop of a tear through the cotton, and he closed his eyes as he wrapped his arms around her. She smelled like dust and antiseptic, and something he realized was hope. He held her as her sobs came in slow, ragged waves, and he knew without a doubt that this was the most important thing he had ever done. When her breathing finally evened out and she pulled back to scrub at her face, he didn't say anything about the tears. He only smoothed her hair back from her forehead and nodded toward the bed. "Why don't you get some rest?" he said. "I'll be right down the hall if you need anything." She looked at the bed and then back at him, and for the first time since he had met her, she gave him a smile so small it felt almost like a secret. He stood and watched as she climbed onto the mattress, her hands smoothing the blanket as though she was still unsure it was really hers. He turned off the lamp by the door, leaving only the soft glow of the nightlight that projected tiny stars onto the ceiling. As he stepped into the hall, he saw her lying on her side, watching the stars with wide, tired eyes. And as he closed the door halfway and stood alone in the dim hallway, Nicholas felt the shape of his life shifting into something bigger and truer than he had ever expected. In the quiet, he let himself believe that maybe this was what family was, two people who had lost everything finding, in each other, a place to begin again. I think the ending of this story is deeply moving because it doesn't pretend that all pain can be erased overnight. Instead, it shows how a single act of bravery, a little girl saving a boy she'd never met, can open the door to something neither of them dared to hope for: belonging. What I love most is that Nicholas doesn't swoop in as a perfect savior. He's uncertain, afraid he'll get it wrong, and haunted by his own grief. That makes his promise to Hannah feel so real. It isn't about charity or guilt, it's about a genuine choice to stay, to keep showing up even when it's hard. To me, this ending is hopeful in the truest sense. It doesn't wrap everything in a neat bow, but it leaves us believing that the bonds built in that quiet kitchen and the softly lit bedroom will grow stronger every day. In the end, it's a reminder that family isn't always the one you're born with. Sometimes it's the one you build, slowly and imperfectly, when you dare to let someone in.